In my first video, I tried to make an impassioned plea to Thunderfoot, as a scientist, to be more careful about his rhetoric and application of logic. But why Thunderfoot? Let me explain. If this is the set of things that are true, and this is the set of things that you believe, most people think the relationship between these two sets looks like this. But in fact, it really looks more like this. This is a fundamental aspect of science. Knowledge is provisional. When a scientist is about to look at their experimental results for the first time, they are acutely aware of the fact that the data might disagree with their theory, meaning they might be wrong, and that they might have been wrong the entire time, no matter how convinced they were. I figured that if I had a chance of getting through to anyone, it would be a scientist. But you see, this is why I love science and skepticism so much. It has helped to free my mind. I am willing to admit that right now, I certainly hold opinions and beliefs that are wrong, and it's possible that I'm wrong about this debate. How many of you can freely admit that to yourself? If you really care about being right, and not just about thinking you are right, it is necessary that you understand and believe that you could be wrong. Say it with me. I could be wrong. Good. One more time. I could be wrong. The only way we can be confident in our beliefs is if we constantly and honestly challenge them. So I challenge you to continue watching my videos, especially if you disagree with me. So then, how come so many people think this way rather than this way? Well, simply put, because logic is hard. We assume that for something to be true, it has to make sense to us, but this is a false notion. Let's say I have 3 doors, and behind one door there's a prize. I ask you to pick a door. Let's say you pick that one. I then open one of the other doors that doesn't have the prize and ask if you want to switch doors. There are now 2 doors, one has a prize, one doesn't. You apparently have a 50-50 chance of being right either way. However, that's not true. There is in fact a 2/3 chance that the prize is behind the other door, so you were always better off to switch doors. Doesn't make sense, does it? But it's true. This is called the Monty Hall problem. If you have already heard about the Monty Hall problem, that doesn't invalidate my point because it's overwhelmingly likely that the first time you heard this, it didn't make sense to you either. Something doesn't have to make sense to you to be true. Therefore, rejecting something just because it doesn't make sense to you is irrational. We didn't evolve to be logical. In fact, our brains evolved to find patterns. These patterns develop into beliefs, and we then look for ways to support those beliefs. Simply put, research has shown that we do not evaluate the evidence and use logic to establish our beliefs, but in fact, we establish our beliefs first, and then try to rationalize them. That is how our brains evolved to think. Think again about the Monty Hall problem. You see 2 doors and 1 prize. You recognize the pattern as being a 50-50 pattern, and you will try to rationalize that belief. It's not until you honestly admit to yourself that you could be wrong and consider the alternatives that you will start to understand the solution. Even Max Planck, the father of quantum physics, knew that it was hard to convince people of something they didn't want to believe. Quantum physics doesn't make sense, which is why he had this to say. A new scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die and a new generation grows up that is familiar with it. It's no coincidence that as soon as we developed a system designed to filter out and reduce our biases and illogical tendencies, otherwise known as the scientific method, that our society began advancing at an unprecedented rate. This is because our natural illogical tendencies were holding us back. Humans are not inherently logical. This is true of all humans. You are not immune. If you think you are rational, you're not. It is an unnatural skill that takes time to develop. For example, I've heard many people try to invalidate the debate about sexism in video games by referring to the debate about violence in video games, which concluded that violence in video games is not a problem. Let's analyze this claim logically. Every debate looks like this. You have an assertion, violence in video games is a problem, and there are people who agree and disagree. There is a debate, and eventually usually one side wins. We are always debating different topics at different times, and after enough permutations, you get to a debate that shares a topic with a previous debate. In this case, whether or not sexism in video games is a problem. The idea that the first one has any influence on the second one is an illogical conclusion, based solely on the coincidence that they are both about video games. If the debates happened in reverse order, and we had already decided that sexism is a problem in video games, would you then argue that automatically violence must also be a problem? Of course not. Why then would you presume that the violence debate has any influence on the sexism debate? Is it because you have already decided that sexism in video games is not a problem, and you are therefore just trying to rationalize that belief? Still don't believe me? Let's break it down. When we talk about violence in video games, what we're almost always talking about is murder, because most violent video games are about killing.
They say when plotting your revenge, you should dig 2 graves. One for your enemy, and one for yourself. I can tell you right now, 2 just ain't gonna be enough.
So let's compare murder to sexism. Murder is hard to do. Sexism is often subconscious. Murder leaves a lot of evidence. Sexism leaves no evidence, unless it gets violent. Murder is easy to prove. Sexism is hard to prove. Murder is universally considered to be wrong. Sexism is often ignored or considered non-existent. Murder has the harshest legal penalties. Sexism is not illegal, unless someone discriminates based on sex and that person can prove it. Murder is easy to notice. Sexism is subtle and hard to notice, especially for men. Anytime a person engages in a violent act, not just murder, there is always a reasonably good chance that they themselves could be injured or go to jail. Violence is nothing like sexism. The barrier to entry for all forms of violence is much higher than sexism. Now I hear you saying, how can you be fine with violence in video games except when it's violence against women? That's not what we're saying. We're not worried about somebody murdering a stripper in a game and then murdering a stripper in real life.
Nevertheless, they trivialize and exploit female suffering as a way to ratchet up the emotional or sexual stakes for the player.
So I don't want to hear any more about violence in this debate. That's an entirely different issue with different considerations and different realities. I don't have a problem with violence in video games. I don't think Anita has a problem with violence in video games. Violence is far too obvious and illegal, whereas sexism and objectification is much more subtle. So you have to ask yourself, what led you to believe that these 2 issues are related? Another false comparison is that of Jack Thompson to Anita Sarkeesian, implying that she is doing the exact same thing as Jack Thompson, and they both got death threats, so it's equal, right? Well, let's take a look. Jack is a lawyer. Anita, a critic. Jack has said that video games are dangerous physical appliances that teach a kid how to kill efficiently and to love it. Anita believes there is too much objectification and sexism in the video game industry. Jack lobbied to regulate the video game industry. Anita wants game developers to use fewer tropes in their games that natively portray women. Jack has sued a number of game developers for hundreds of millions of dollars. Anita raises money for her cause purely through donation. Jack has said that Rockstar Games is
run by a bunch of sociopaths.
Jack has compared GTA 4 to polio. Jack believes video games are not constitutionally protected free speech. Jack tried to link multiple specific murders and school shootings to video games, on TV and in court. Jack was disbarred in 2007 over allegations of professional misconduct.
Typically, the school shooters train literally on video games to do this. Dawson College last year, Montreal, the shooter, the killer, trained on a game called Super Columbine Massacre. Also Postal 2, both of which are murder simulation games in which the school shooters can rehearse and plan for and make themselves more efficient in these kind of murderous rampages.
Likewise, engaging with these games is not going to magically transform players into raging sexists. We typically don't have a monkey-see, monkey-do direct cause and effect relationship with the media we consume. Cultural influence works in much more subtle and complicated ways.
How anyone could consider these 2 examples equal is beyond me. And if you thought these 2 cases were equal, then you have to ask yourself, why would you allow yourself to believe something so easily shown to be false? Was it because you had already decided what you want to believe and look for things that confirm that belief? Clearly, some people are lying to you, but Anita is not one of them. I've heard many people argue that she is not being harassed because she's a woman, but because she's lying. Okay, let's evaluate that claim. Considering that, according to the ESA, 48% of gamers are women, and Anita's series is all about women in video games, how can we see an overwhelming majority of men who are the ones harassing her? if in fact she were lying, and it were anywhere near as obvious as they claim it is, then wouldn't we see a much more equal number of men and women accusing her of lying? So, either there is some unknown force that is causing mostly men to be the one to see her lies, or women are just not clever enough to see them. Now, I can already see people in the comments saying, well, what about her? Or her? Or her? Yes, of course, some women disagree with her. But find me thousands of women who not only disagree with her, but harass her as a result, and then you'll have a point. Now you might be saying, but of course she's lying. She said she wasn't a fan of video games in 2010, and then said she is a gamer in her Kickstarter campaign. Well, it's pretty clear that in 2010 she was talking specifically about male-dominated action games, not all video games.
200 dicks on the dance floor. 200 dicks on the dance floor. Too many dicks.
But if you want to interpret what she said in the most narrow way possible because it agrees with your existing beliefs, go ahead. Gamer or not, her points are just as valid. Now you might be saying, but of course she's lying. She cherry-picks all those clips and takes them out of context. She certainly does cherry-pick and take those clips out of context. I will freely admit that. Here's the kicker, though. So does she.
Of course, if you look at any of these games in isolation, you'll be able to find incidental narrative circumstances that can be used to explain away the inclusion of violence against women as a plot device. But just because a particular event might make sense within the internal logic of a fictional narrative, that doesn't in and of itself justify its use.
Of course, there are contextual explanations for the clips she shows. If there weren't, then the games wouldn't make any sense. The entire point of her series is to show how game developers frequently build narratives and stories that allow for the negative portrayal of women. We are all fully aware that the clips are taken out of context, because the context is the problem, and she just uses the clips to illustrate how many contexts are created to allow the perpetuation of those tropes. So if you thought the argument that she is using these clips out of context was a valid one, you're completely wrong. Somehow, you were fooled into believing that she was purposefully taking clips out of context for the express purpose of deceiving her viewers. When I see what's happening, and I hear from men that it has nothing to do with sexism, it's because of this, or that, or the other thing, I'm insulted. And if you agree with them, then it's about time you stopped looking for ways to rationalize your existing beliefs and started seeing what's really going on. Because even if everything they were saying was true, it wouldn't come close to justifying how these women are being treated.